Just very quickly, Lesser President. So you are
think
calling for
justice
racial equity is equivalent to calling trans people groomers.
But if you genuinely believe that they're groomers, you should be allowed to say so. In the same way that when the left calls all right-wingers fascist, I don't think that's terrorism in the same way, because we all know what happens to fascists, or they get punched, right?
Well, no, it's self-defense. They get like the idea, the justification for no. Shut the fuck up and listen.
It's stochastic terrorism.
It's so descriptive. I think it's great. I don't see why there's any.
It's an excellent word in the first place.
It's a useful word for them.
Because to you, it is obvious, but it is not obvious. Does not have a use case where we
it's
can
an
use
unhelpful term. It just points to something real accurately. Whick doesn't even know what crystal knot was. So like.
I'm not defending it. Stop. I'm not defending it.
No, it's not distinct in the idea of contributing to an ambiance, right? Communist Manifesto.
No, but the issue isn't just contributing.
Hold on,
no, hang on. No, this is important.
I'm in the middle of responding.
I know, but my response is better. So
your response to my response that I haven't said yet?
Gotcha. Exactly.
Great lineup today. We're going to be discussing stochastic terrorism today, and why I think, personally, it's not a very helpful term. A few members of my community and others have decided they wanted to address this with me, so I decided to kind of enter the fray. Usually I'm moderating when I'm on my channel, but today, Portland is Burning will be moderating. He has graciously agreed to do so. So I've given him the mute powers, and please listen to him when he tells you to shut up. It's probably for a good reason, because people can't hear you when we're all talking over each other. Other than that, you guys know how it goes. Okay.
Today, Whick wields no authority. All authority shall flow through me, and I would appreciate you giving me the correct amount of respect. So
let's start off with the actual
opening.
This is what we're doing right now?
Yeah, this opening. Go ahead. What's your take on stochastic terrorism?
2-minute cap, man. The timer's running.
Oh, shit. All right. So, hello, everybody. My name is Lactoid. You can find me in Anti-Communism United, Discord and Twitch. Gotta get that in there. My criticism of the concept of stochastic terrorism is, as used in contemporary politics, it is an infinite regression that is selectively ignored based on the politics of those that invoke it. It is amorphous and often slimely redefined whenever politically convenient. Therefore, I want to lock in a definition. Stochastic terrorism was well defined, I think, by President Sunday yesterday as, quote, a terroristic act that is contributing to an ambiance or generating an ambiance for which individual acts of terror or violence are more likely to occur, for which the speaker bears some responsibility for the acts committed. The problem with this concept should be obvious. Infinite regression is antithetical to the legal framework of this country and is thus limited by the concept of proximate cause. In the case of speech, there are even more protections. Not only does incitement require that speech be intentionally directed at causing violence, but that it also must be likely to produce imminent violence. Why do we care about the legal framework? Because the legal framework here recognizes an underlying right and properly recognizes a hazard that must be limited. The reason for the limits are obvious. We can think of a million examples where infinite regression to the point of legal and moral absurdity. James Hodgkinson shot Steve Scalise motivated by the rhetoric of Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders must be a stochastic terrorist. Let's not get started with Islam, BLM, PETA, or environmental organizations. What better way to encourage violence than saying the world is ending, which is exactly why we have so much environmental terrorism, so you better shut up about global warming. This is obviously absurd. Bernie Sanders can rant about his dumb shit. That does not make him a terrorist, and everyone here would agree. But blinded by dogmatism, our opponents would not agree that conservatives should be able to levy reasonable criticisms. Stochastic terrorism, as it is used in contemporary politics, is a term reserved solely for the dogmatic motivation of unjust censorship.
Okay, he did not get the definition of concise from me, to be clear.
We allot a 2-minute maximum here because Lactoid is lawyer-brained. Weaponized discourse, you're next. Go ahead.
So stochastic terrorism has emerged with a meteoric popularity, specifically in the last few days, but obviously the last recent months as well. It's an understudied and it's an underdeveloped term, but it is relatively intuitive. And I sense this intuitiveness comes from an eagerness to apply the term, in part because I think the lone wolf narrative has become deeply dissatisfying, especially given the political standstill on how to take appropriate action against this phenomenon. It is also fun and politically useful to weaponize weaponize this term against our enemies, of whom the presence of obviously rising violent rhetoric is definitely a concern. But I am concerned that this term is being inappropriately deployed. At best, I see this word turning into yet another thought-terminating cliche to be wielded carelessly by online label frogs. And at worst, as an American who lived through the 9/11 era of increased state surveillance, I am concerned about the repercussions of weaponizing specifically the term terrorist, which in the hands of the state is a very dangerous accusation that has potentially serious repercussions for free speech for everyone. In truth, the term is probably very useful, but not in the way it's become popularly understood. I've liked reading Ramon Spy, who in his book, The Age of Lone Wolf Terrorism, offers probably the most comprehensive study of the phenomenon and offers Alex Jones as an example of a potential stochastic terrorist, which I might point out sets a very high bar of maliciousness. In this book, he also says there's no one factor fully responsible for stoking stochastic terrorism. It can happen through a combination of mainstream media, polarizing political discourse, and more frequently, social media. So it's my understanding that if stochastic terrorism exists, and it probably does, it exists in an ambient environment of violent rhetoric, of which it's undeniable both sides are willing to participate in. A study from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace found that 1 in 5 Republicans and 1 in 7 Democrats are willing to, they find politically violent rhetoric and threats justified. So I think that we need to look at, if we want this term to be useful, we need to be able to not apply it asymmetrically or hypocritically.
No favoritism. That is 2 minutes. President Sunday, you are up.
I think it's useful. We live in a world of unprecedented mass media exposure to events, and that can be manipulated to certain ends. And I like the term stochastic terrorism because it highlights that issue and allows us to hold people to account when they engage irresponsibly with that mechanism. I found the last speaker's point about the term terrorism interesting, though, so look forward to exploring that.
SmugBug, you're up.
Yeah. Yeah, so I do think it's a useful term. I think it does get misused, and I do think it gets used by one side more than the other. But I do think it's one of those terms that's very, very broad and easily applicable to different kinds of rhetoric at different scales. I think that one thing that is probably important to note is that the kinds of people that may respond to that kind of stochastic terrorism rhetoric, whatever you want to call it, fall into a few different categories. There are some people who will self-radicalize in such a way that they were always going to commit violence, but this only became the lens with which they committed violence. So there are non-political school shootings, for example, but there are not always. A lot of them are generally personal compared to some of the politically violent attacks of so-called lone wolf terrorists or people who respond to rhetoric that results in a kind of stochastic terrorism. The problem there is that there are also groups that can be rallied towards violence that wouldn't otherwise have had a proclivity to violence. And the more you leave solutions kind of off the table, not considered, which tends to be a problem on the right more than the left, where they'll leave the quiet part quiet. They won't really talk about the solution so much as this impending threat that requires a solution, and then they leave you to devise it. This is quite similar to a lot of the research that's been done, particularly in how ISIS has found remote ways to radicalize people, in devising your own strategies, building your own method of achieving whatever ideological goals you have, and having those goals be a radicalizing force in your life. So there are groups of people who would always commit violence, and then that becomes political violence. I do think there is another group of people who are willing to commit violence if they're radicalized politically as well. I think that the best demonstration of that is probably January 6th. While that wasn't necessarily a mass terrorist event, that was the kind of situation where people who didn't have a proclivity for violence necessarily at the start were goaded into it through rhetoric directly.
Okay, just a quick reminder, brevity is the soul of wit, a la President Sunday. Whick, you're up.
But is it the soul of Whick? We'll find out. Stochastic terrorism is a misunderstood, oft misapplied, and very unhelpful concept. Relatively new, it does not have a lot of literature behind it. It's not something that's been well researched or studied. It was a tool designed to try and explain another phenomenon, which is the lone wolf terrorism phenomenon. The problems with this become immediately apparent when you kind of look into it, and Lactoid kind of alluded to some of this. The explanations for these types of events, these violent events that are attributed to stochastic terrorism is all done post-hoc, because necessity, it has to be, right? It has to be by necessity. It's trivially true that given enough time, violence will be done against any group, person, or institution that is criticized extremely. So if you look, you could probably find someone, right, who's criticized someone who's been attacked. And what stochastic terrorism does, and where it falls short for me, is it looks back and it says, aha, see, that's what did it, that these things were connected. It led to violence. It had to be. But this doesn't necessarily follow. When you look at the individual instances of mass shootings or mass violence, there are a myriad of factors at play, of which rhetoric, if it plays a part at all, is a very, very small part. Stochastic terrorism ignores those other parts largely, at least has how it's dealt with the mainstream, right? To its detriment. It's like we're in a flood and we're running around with fire hydrants to try to put out electrical fires that might be started by the flooding, when what we should be doing is grabbing sandbags, repairing the levees, and pumping out the water. In the open, I'll be discussing all this further, but suffice to say that stochastic terrorism, while trivially true, is too broad and applies to far more than it intends, and thus becomes unhelpful when trying to reduce these heinous attacks and acts of violence.
All right, Stabby, you are up.
So I would like to point out that the term stochastic terrorism has immense uses. We are actually running into a historical problem here already. Benjamin Franklin, I disagree with him, but he has already pointed out that educating the masses is what's going to be the biggest problem with democracy, and we're running into it right now. We have to educate people how to use the term. We don't need to call somebody a stochastic terrorist. We can say somebody is utilizing stochastic terrorism and start to pick apart the stochastic terrorism itself so that we can neuter what they're saying. That's the whole fucking point. In a world with free speech, you neuter what the speech is right out of the gate, and then you can move forward from there. We can go all the way back in history, as far back as 1170 to Thomas Becket, when Henry one of the many Henrys, okay, it was one of the early ones, like single digits here. One of the Henrys said, well, no one rid me of this meddlesome priest, and he was assassinated. So you can see how we have been able to use these things before. I believe that Henry was actually very contrite and actually went to repent, because that was a very big deal, and he had a problem with it, especially because he believed his soul was now damned. But the point remains that there is a level of responsibility that we have, and the best way to handle stochastic terrorism is to educate people on what exactly it is. Don't call people the stochastic terrorist, and actually drive it home, because I'm going to use a little example, and we'll see how quickly you agree with me that stochastic terrorism actually exists, and that I can use it just as well as you.
Okay, thank you, Stabby. With that, we'll open it up to open discussion. If I tell you guys to shut the fuck up, please do it responsively so I don't have to mute you. Go ahead.
Whick, I do have a problem with one thing you said, which is that any institution that gets criticized is eventually going to have some kind of violence done to it. While that may be true, over a long enough period of time, sure, but there are degrees, right? Like, you're equivocating critiquing an organization with declaring that organization an impending threat, right? Like, part of the problem of degrees with stochastic terrorism is this idea of self-defense, and we see this on both sides, right? From the right, we see it when it comes to like the LGBT stuff. They're going to groom your kids. From the left, we see it in people like 𝕵𝖎𝖎𝖙 with the trans genocide. They're gonna they're mobilizing to prepare a genocide. You need to pick up guns. So like in both cases, there's an impending threat there that increases the requirements for self-defense, and broadly speaking, across most political domains, like self-defense is accepted as reasonable. So the obvious conclusion to those like rhetorical strategies is to defend yourself, prepare to defend yourself. Now, whether you then go to try and preemptively, commit violence on that institution afterwards, that's where the problem arises. But in both cases, you're saying this is a group that is aggressing on you. You're going to have to do something about it at some point. We won't say what that is. That's the stochastic terrorism.
Yeah, but
really,
go on.
I wanted to pick something out of that. I think that arming yourselves, while yes, we can compare this to stochastic terrorism for sure, that's probably an element of it. I truly do believe, and I'm not in agreement with it at all, but I do believe that the United States, our gun problem, and the fact that we perpetually refuse to do anything about this and the mass violence problem in America, I think that's why people are like, you need to arm yourself, because that's been what we've been selling. So I want to make sure we don't like press that too close to stochastic terrorism, because I think that that's something that's organically rising out of the
stochastic terrorism is going to be more likely to be obvious in America, a place where far more people have access to force multiplying violence than any other country, right? So it's going to be one of the most obvious areas. Oh well, all right.
So to answer your question, or try to kind of address your point, since it wasn't really a question, yes, like, I understand what you're saying, but this is why I find the term unhelpful, because it can apply to almost any kind of rhetoric. Look at what happened with Enron, right? Like, what you're criticizing here, or what you're pointing out, is simply journalism in another term. Like, because if there's an actual threat, we need to be able to report on that threat, right? And we need to not mince words. So if there's actually people that are, you think and believe, are coming to harm you, if there's a fire in the theater, or you believe there's a fire in the theater, we need people to be able to feel free to say that and to express that, and not to try to paint them as responsible for violence that may or may not happen because of that, right? Like, my problem with the term is it creates this kind of easy solution. It turns something that is pretty irrational and tries to paint a story about it to make us feel better, because we're all very deeply uncomfortable with this idea that people just sometimes snap and become violent for a myriad of factors, right? There's environment at play, there's opportunity, right? Like, can they get a hands on a weapon? Can they find a target, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of these people, as you mentioned in your opening, right? Like, there's a great many who are just going to, like, they're ticking time bombs, okay? So that's my response, and I hope it was a little rambly, but, you know.
Anybody, Stabby, go ahead.
I have a challenge for Whick really quickly. I use something often with your chat and in your Discord. You've probably seen me use it before. I say that these 9 beliefs are identical to what the Taliban believes, so that I can directly challenge a conservative when they're spouting something and they're saying, it's actually just a sweet little tradition, and I'm trying to show them, no, it's actually bad. And so I use it as a challenge, as a rhetorical device. If I ever move that to telling everyone else, Matt Walsh thinks that your kids are ready to marry at 13 because that's when they're the most fertile, they're coming for your children. If I ever move that to target the conservatives, would you call that stochastic terrorism? I can't be jailed for it, but I am obviously trying to cause harm to conservatives because I have switched it from a rhetorical device to challenge a conservative's beliefs, and I have moved it to the little terrorists are living in our own.
So there's a lot packed into that statement, trying to cause harm. Like, I want to hurt the Republicans' electoral chances. I don't want them to win, right? Like, I want to harm them in that way. But that is substantively different, right, than this idea of going out and doing physical harm to them, right?
I gave that example because quite obviously it's not, I want to win the vote. Quite obviously, if I'm saying this is a terrorist problem we must eliminate, no, it is obvious. If I say that
this is a problem, you saying it's an obvious thing is because to you it is obvious, but it is not obvious.
It's about the conclusion it's about the conclusion you come to, right? Like, the problem here is that you can critique them, right? You can critique the Republicans, but then you tell people what to do. Whereas people who, appeal to this broad impending threat of Republican fascism, and then, which, has some evidence, right? Like, some shit's going down. But ultimately, like, people who appeal to that, like, the subversion of democracy, and then they just stay silent on what you should actually do about it. Like, you would probably say, go vote, go canvass, get involved in your local political process. And some people might say, well, when democracy gets subverted, or it's already subverted, then, there's only one thing you can do. And that's how you end up with Jan 6s, right? It's when people think there is no electoral process for dealing with their problems.
If I may, very quickly, we're moving a bit afield from the usefulness of the term. We're talking about the danger of its overextension. But on this point, generally when we talk about stochastic terrorism, we aren't just talking about people reacting irrationally to any sort of potentially inflammatory language about any given topic. We're particularly concerned with people using dehumanizing language that targets a specific group. And so in that case, I think the usefulness rhetorically is that it does put up a chilling effect around recklessly using language that targets some one group as a blight on society that someone can be reasonably expected to infer somewhere justifies violence to a greater degree than, say, like the Unabomber because of the bare fact of the publishing of Silent Spring or something,
I get what you're saying. And
And I mean, by the way,
just-
very quickly, Whick, to your point, that goes back again to the overuse of the term stochastic terrorist itself, which we can imagine can be used in an identical way. You can identify a political group or a political person as a stochastic terrorist and use that language in such a way as it highlights that person for a particular kind of violence potentially. I don't think the term is particularly useful at the back end, and we can get into because there's different understandings of what stochastic terrorism is.
When you say back end, what do you mean?
The origins of the term stochastic terrorism, as far as I have been able to see, given my vast study of the topic over the span of an hour and a half, is twofold. So there's a paper that was, I believe, targeted at insurance companies by Gordon Wu that was trying to discover the rhythm of terroristic attacks for the purposes of insurance evaluation. And then there was an article online by someone, I think it was called 𝕼𝖎𝖐𝐸.
G2 Geek, but yeah.
Thank you, G2 Geek. Which was not that. So Wu's definition was basically just highlighting the stochastic environment, and it was particularly concerned with the stochastic basis upon which the rhythm of terroristic attacks takes place, whereas G2 Geek was concerned with stochastic terrorism as an act of terrorism that attempts to use a stochastic process to incite a terroristic attack or increase the likelihood of a terrorist attack as an act of terror in and of itself. So these two things are pretty different. When we're talking about targeting someone like Tucker Carlson as a stochastic terrorist, we're talking about that latter case by G2 Geek. When we're talking about stochastic terrorist as a more appropriate term for a lone wolf attack that occurs as the result of a stochastic process, we're using something that's probably not just limited to Gordon Wu's definition, but it's probably not the only thing that Gordon Wu's definition indicates, but is more appropriately understood in those terms.
Well, in both cases, I have issues, right? So.
I'd like to hear from Lactoid and Weaponized Discourse next. So.
But if I can respond just briefly.
Yeah,
so,
you can respond totally. I just want to make sure that we get everybody involved, and they haven't yet.
I
promise.
Yeah, shut up, Whick.
True, right? This is something that I should do. But to answer your question, if I can remember it after Portland so wonderfully derailed my thought process, it's that when it comes to things like accusing Tucker Carlson, right? This specifically, I want to drill down on this just a little bit here. This is what the problem is currently with the term, right? And Lactoid mentioned it. Shout out to him, right? That it's being asymmetrically applied, right? So he can engage in rhetoric that leads to violence, but then we look at Bernie Sanders, or we look at the attack in 2012 against the Family Research Council. A man came in and he had a bunch of Chick-fil-A sandwiches in his bag and 50 rounds of ammo, and he wanted to shoot them all up. He shot a guard. Then he was thankfully arrested, right? They took him down. They stopped him. And when he was asked why he did it. It was because the Southern Poverty Law Center had said that this group and other groups were trying to take away his rights and try to stop him from being able to get married as a gay man and things like that. This is what he claimed was the case. And so we would never call the people who were saying, hey, these groups are trying to take away your rights, terrorists or engaging in stochastic terrorism. But it fits the same definition that we would use against someone like Tucker Carlson. That's why I find it just
it's a matter of degrees. That's the whole point.
Just make sure to acknowledge that there is an asymmetrical application of actual terrorist events. They are overwhelmingly far above 90% conservative attacks. So let's just make sure that's one of the reasons for the asymmetry there.
Oh, these guys are going to accept ISIS as conservatives in the same way that you are right there.
When we talk,
does the resident conservative Lactoid have anything to say about the disproportionate rate at which his brethren commit terrorist attacks?
Sure. So
he's a libertarian. I didn't know he was conservative.
It's disavow time.
So, I disavow people who commit violence, terrorists. I think it's a problem. I almost feel as though perhaps maybe there's a little bit of context I'm missing, because it feels as though as the discussion is being carried on from before this panel a little bit. I wanted just to make the point that it seems as though in contemporary politics, the thing that you guys are saying is that's just misuse or over application, seems to be the actual contemporary political application. right?
Yep.
Like when we look at like currently, like what happens, like who are being called stochastic terrorists? When is this term being used? It's always used. It's, at least in my perception, it's always being used in these terms of you advocated for conservative position A. These people committed violence, and therefore, like you are somewhat responsible. Tucker Carlson somewhat responsible. Trump was somewhat responsible. Despite the fact he clearly was not. But Trump was somewhat responsible, and we take a look at all that, and we attribute blame for simply for not incitement of violence as specified in the law, but on a principle that just simply doesn't exist in terms of any kind of statute. It doesn't exist in terms of just common sense, right? There is a infinite regression problem. If you're going to say that, like, it's true right now, there are far right-wing terrorists that engage in attacks. And we also just got off in 2020 of a mass riots, which no justice, no peace, and the riots won't stop until we get racial equity. I mean, is that stochastic terrorism? When you say that the riots won't stop until this happens, I mean, if that's not stochastic terrorism under your guys' definition, it seems as though you're applying it asymmetrically.
Wait, I don't agree that that's quite the same thing as stochastic terrorism. Wait, you're saying that the threat of them saying we're going to do this thing unless you comply with us that's kind of like regular terrorism, just on a larger with a capacity of people, right?
So there were people.
It would be helpful if we had a list, though, wouldn't it? Though, Lactoid, it would help if we had a list. If a conservative commits a crime, what words are banned so that conservatives don't have to have hurt feelings? Give us the list and we can move forward.
I'm very confused on the question. I'm not advocating for any banned words.
And I don't think that we should be the next panel that advocates for lists of stochastic terrorists or stochastic terroristic terms. Like, let's just
be very careful. Be very careful.
I want to add one more point.
Be very careful what I actually asked for right there. You are saying that there are certain ways that it is being applied to conservatives over much. So, what words are we not allowed to say to ensure that we know the boundaries of stochastic terrorism for this group versus all the other groups?
What?
Okay, Stabby. The concern. Okay, Stabby. Let me be brief.
I think I have a solution for this right afterwards. I do think I have a I do think I have a helpful.
Stabby. Yeah. The point is that is not that his feelings are hurt. To Lactoid's point, right? He is saying that this is being used exclusively against the left's political opponents, and that seems to be the use case for this term.
Well, more than that. More than that. Well, so more than that. Not only is that I think it's being asymmetrically applied, but you also have to look at the underlying motivation of the use of this term. When you're calling somebody a terrorist, there's a reason for that, right? There's an obvious, like, what you're trying to do is, if you're calling them a stochastic terrorist, you're trying to censor them, you're trying to limit what they can say, and potentially get the law involved. I mean, that's what the underlying goal is, obviously.
Might I ask a question?
What's your question?
Of the previous speaker, yeah. What exactly is the left-wing corollary for calling all trans people groomers exactly?
Sorry, I missed what exactly is the left-wing what?
What is the left-wing corollary for calling all trans people groomers?
Corollary.
What is the left-wing equivalent for calling all trans people groomers?
Probably calling all right-wing people fascists, right?
Unless we... the riots won't stop until we have racial equity.
I don't see how
during the BLM riots, the riots won't stop until we have racial equity. No justice, no peace.
Hang on. Sure. So you think calling for racial equity is equivalent to calling trans people groomers?
If you're saying the riots won't stop until we have racial equity, or no justice, or no justice, no peace.
What are you called again?
What does that mean?
How to address you.
Wait, who said the riots won't stop?
Okay, Lesser, hang on, Stabby. It's gonna be one quick second. I'm gonna be quiet for most of the panel. Just very quickly, Lesser President. So you are equivocating between a stochastic process. You know what stochastic means, right? It's randomness. And a deliberate political activity that has set terms for its conclusion. These aren't the same kind of thing. We're not talking about equivalence here. The riots weren't the result of language. The riots were responses to actual actions and were organized political events. Stochastic terrorism is when there is a random process that is instigated at some point, and then through an indeterminate process of dun, 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 somebody gets the right combination of messages, is situated in the right place, and decides to commit an act of violence. That's stochastic terrorism on the back end. So, or
Okay.
at least on the front end.
So can I ask you then, if you go out and you say the riots won't stop until we get racial equity, or if you say no justice, no peace, does this contribute to an ambiance in which individual acts of terror or violence are more likely to occur?
I don't think so. No, this is a political.
You don't think so?
Statement about this is a statement about the conditions of a political movement.
Actually, I would actually dispute that.
It clearly does.
I don't think just because it contributes to an ambience. The difference is that the riot is not. It's not a threat that you're going to do something if something doesn't take place. It's putting out the messaging that results in behaviors taking place. You're encouraging, statistically, a greater propensity for violence through the messaging.
How about this
That's the
as
point.
an example? Because that's a pretty bad example, Lactoid. I'm not going to be real with you.
Yeah.
How is that a bad
There's better examples. Let's use this. Let's use this one. Let's use this one. Stop.
That's better. All right, fine.
Let's use this one, okay? Let's say when people are saying, cops will kill you. They're literally out there trying to kill you. They're going and arresting minorities, and they're trying to kill them. That, I would say, is a much better example, because what are you supposed to do about that, right? Like, if this is something that people tell you, and this is something that you actually believe is happening, right, to a great degree, that your life is actually in danger, it justifies certain actions, right? And would fit the definition, in my opinion, of stochastic terrorism.
I just want to point out, it's really important. I just need to point this out.
I accept Whick's analysis of the situation and permit the conversation to continue. I do feel it's worth kind of reframing and pointing out that the advocacy for the continuation of an ongoing protest is in no way stochastic, and there's something about the random nature of the calls to violence that are suggested by the rhetoric that Whick was just alluding to, and that is something that correlates a lot more directly with the stochastic nature of the event. So we could just kind of nail down this definition of stochastic. Is talking about increasing the likelihood of a random event, not encouraging the continuation of an ongoing event.
I want to address that. But when in my opening I said the definition is amorphous and often redefined when politically convenient. I think that is maybe that's what's sort of happening. Because my understanding and how it's used all the time against conservatives or people generally when they don't like what they're saying politically is. You're saying something that's contributing to an ambiance that makes something more likely to occur.
I want to clarify.
That's the point against Tucker Carlson, right? I
have a clarifying question here. I have a clarifying question. You have said that twice, where it's to label people, and I'm wondering here. And you said to use the police against them or to get them in trouble with the law,
or censor them.
Hold on. Do we have any cases whatsoever of anyone being charged with stochastic terrorism?
No, because it's not in any statutes. It's not domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism is against the law, but stochastic terrorism has no basis in American jurisprudence.
Is anyone advocating to make it illegal on this panel?
No. So here's
then why are we discussing it?
So here's my next question to you. Do you recall in the beginning when I said that stochastic terrorism is useful to describe an event or to describe what is happening without having to turn to the term stochastic terrorist? I said stochastic terrorism needs to have its well-defined uses and not be used as the term stochastic terrorist. There's a massive difference between those two terms.
So if you say that somebody is engaging in stochastic terrorism, does that make them a stochastic terrorist?
You can say that they are engaging in it and still not make them a stochastic terrorist, to be completely
I'd bite
honest.
the bullet on that, Stabby. I'd just say yeah.
Yeah, it's
No,
not that big
I
deal.
would say no, because I can be engaging in bread making and I'm not a baker.
But you're making
Definitionally, I believe you become a terrorist.
Okay. So regardless of, this is a weird point. Regardless of whether or not we're going to call them stochastic terrorists or not, people obviously do. And in contemporary politics, that's what's being done. People are alleging that certain actors are engaging in stochastic terrorism and that there's a moral weight associated with this allegation, right? Because they're contributing to an ambiance.
Do you have a replacement term we can use for when stochastic terrorism happens, if this is a term we cannot use?
I don't think advocating for a genuinely held position is again, unless you're like again directly inciting under the context of the law, I don't think that that's something that is like terrorism in any regard.
Wait, so it's about your intent?
It just doesn't have a lot of use as a term.
If I may very quickly, so so you do not believe that calling a group a slur that is associated with making acts of violence against them appropriate, because we know how people talk about groomers. You don't think that which creates like an ambience of frankly terror, increased the likelihood of these people being attacked or abused in public. You don't think that's appropriate to call an act of terrorism, to do that deliberately for the purposes of inciting terror against that group for a political
I mean, so there's obviously a political end to it. If you genuinely, I would think you're wrong, but if you genuinely believe that they're groomers, you should be allowed to say so, in the same way that when the left calls all right-wingers fascist, even though that's clearly stupid as fuck. I don't think that's terrorism in the same way, because we all know what happens to fascists, right?
But nobody. Well, what happens to fascists is they get in power and they kill a lot of people. Generally, that's kind of what the
or they get punched, right?
Well, no, it's self-defense. They get like the idea, the justification for no. Shut the fuck up and listen.
That's stochastic terrorism. That's what, yeah. So when you call a right winger a fascist, in your definition.
Wait. Yes, in this definition, which you are refuting and making more amorphous and ambiguous, the definition is, or at least one way that you can do stochastic terrorism is saying this institution or this group has a threat of impending violence. The right wing do this when it comes to grooming. The violence is against your children, and the left does it when we say things like, there's no solution to the cops other than like dismantle it. They're going to kill us. There's no way to solve this democratically. The state is always going to defend them. There's nothing you can do but arm yourself. Or saying that there's like an impending trans genocide. Or the fucking like Kenosha riots, right? Like you could argue that that's a product of stochastic terrorism.
Or calling Republicans fascist, right? Just like you did earlier in this panel.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't call Republican
fascism. Republican fascism that you said was popular and it was upcoming, right? Did you say?
No, I said I was giving you an example of stochastically terroristic rhetoric. Calling all Republicans fascists is stochastic terrorism. Yes, but you're implying that there's going to be. No, it's not. Wait, no, it's not. Hold on. You're implying a threat of impending danger to you, which justifies self-defense. And that self-defense can easily justify... And again, this is all probabilistic. It's smaller and smaller and smaller groups over time. The people who see it as like a real threat, and then the people who have...
It applies to any criticism.
Nice discourse since opening statements. I'd like to toss it to her because she's on the side against SmugBug and the rest of you anyways. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, I've tried to jump in a bit, but I've also just been watching the volleyball sort of bounce back and forth. And I think this is just the heart of my issue, which is that when we get into trying to pin down what stochastic terrorism is, it inevitably turns into a conversation of the violent rhetoric coming from my side is good and defensive, and the violence coming from the other team is the bad one. And so we need to focus on that because that's the issue. When again, I said I didn't hear that. It was blown out. What did you say?
No one is making that argument. No one is saying that it's only justified on one side, and I don't think anyone here has only been attributing it to one side so far. I think we've all been pretty balanced in that, so implying that is a bit silly.
I agree. No, I agree. Everyone on the panel here has been balanced, but I think its most popular usage is what's a conversation. It's great that we can kind of come to a nuanced definition, but that's not necessarily how it's playing out in popular discourse. And it's the popular discourse which is concerning to me. And also to address a point said before from Stabby, which is why are we discussing the legalization? It's because if this keeps trending in the way it is, the rate it is, with the careless weaponization of it, which is not necessarily based in this nuanced definition that we're dealing with, we will eventually see politicians picking this up, and the state will eventually get a hold of the weaponization of the term terrorism, which I have a huge problem with.
What the problem here is that we have to educate on how to use the term stochastic terrorism. The first reason we want to show people how to use it is so that they can understand what is happening when they see somebody engaging with stochastic terrorism. And the second reason we want to be able to educate people is so that they know, God, I'm engaging in stochastic terrorism.
I have I have a quick response to Wick. Sorry about the previous thing. Just twofold. So you
Sure,
mentioned
but
about
then
the
I want
Post-Hoc
to
thing.
respond to Stabby after you. So
Yeah,
go
yeah, sure,
ahead.
sure. Sorry, I just don't want this to be forgotten. So there's two things going on here. First of all, it's not always the case that we only post-hoc identify something as stochastic terrorism. We make an inference that, for example, calling Group X groomers, that may result in an attack farther down the line. It's a fairly reasonable inference that this increases the likelihood of that taking place if there's uptake of that speech, right? The second thing is forensically determining after the fact that a terrorist attack was incited by a stochastic process of like specific types of media consumption. That does not by itself invalidate the point that this was the end product of a stochastic process. That
So-
can be linked to like
No, I
specific
understand.
types of discourse.
I
Yeah,
understand what you're saying, right?
like post-hoc doesn't mean wrong.
So true. And my point, to be very clear, and I'll reiterate it again, is I think stochastic terrorism is a real thing. It's just, again, so hard to kind of pin down. And as Stabby was, and to respond to Stabby and to kind of tie this both together here, like when we talk about educating everyone on what stochastic terrorism is, like, look, this is a field that doesn't have a lot of study behind it. There's not a lot of literature. There's not a lot of academia. It is still being defined in the public space, right?
Oh, good.
It is
So it's
still
absolutely
being
perfect.
formed, but this problem is it's being a volleyball, right? It's being
And that means it's
top-
absolutely if it doesn't. But wait, if it doesn't have a lot of studies and if it doesn't have a lot of history behind it, as this term being used, that will appeal to conservatives immediately already.
jokes aside, okay, I think that yeah, he's
God
We
just
need to
you're
make fun
calling
jokes.
Whoa.
conservatives uneducated. Yes, that's
Blown the
original,
fuck
No,
up.
right?
they don't.
I have
like
no education.
big
Woo.
academia and studies. That is just a joke.
Yeah.
Okay.
The only
You
conservative
fuckers in
on
your
this
ivory
panel-
towers.
Actually, you know, actually, there was one thing I wanted to ask weaponized discourse, which is that do you think that because you mentioned one of the problems is that you feel like it's being used more by one side than the other, maybe not on this panel, but more generally. And I do think it's true. I do think the left has the greater tendency to appeal to the right using stochastic terrorism as part of their rhetoric, right? That is true. Broadly, I think that happens. Do you think that maybe that's because on the left we tend to look more for those kind of abstract ills, whereas on the right they're less keen on looking for these like abstract potential causes of harm, because that just doesn't align with the way that their framework for analyzing the world anyway, right? They tend to point to individual instances of terrible things happening and then blow that up as, hey, this is the narrative, this is the story, this is the bad thing happening, this is what's going to happen to all of us if we're not careful. Whereas on the right, on the left, we tend to be a little bit more focused on the abstract, right? This is the system that results in the violence.
No, I would agree with that. I think there's definitely that hunger for this kind of abstract reason why this violence keeps happening. But that's why I think it's a huge mistake for us to latch onto this word in the current most popular definition, because it's just a little bit too good to be true. We know that lone wolf terrorism has been happening. It's been happening since before 9/11. And there's always been a political narrative that many of these people have ascribed to themselves, in part also because that draws more attention to the attack, right? The Q Club shooter has gotten a lot more attention than the shooting that happened right next day at Walmart, because the Q Club shooter was able to find a political narrative that gives it more attention. The problem is, again, though, is if what we're doing is leaning so heavily on an abstract definition, in which, again, I totally concede that an ambient environment of violent rhetoric is going to produce more opportunities for lone wolf terrorism to access a political narrative that might give their intended violence more attention. But that's exactly the problem. It's because we need to be looking at causation. The word terrorist implies a level of intention and causation that is a huge accusation to levy at someone. I don't really understand why increased violent rhetoric can't really be explained through our understanding of fascism as it is. I don't know why we need to weaponize the term terrorism as well.
I don't think we're necessarily weaponizing the term terrorism. That can also be the case when something's condemnable, but like by and large, what we're calling it terrorism is because there is an intent specifically to cause a fearful response or an intimidating, an intimidated reaction in the target group. Which again, like calling an entire group a groomers, people who harm children, is absolutely doing.
Right, but so if I say I need to defend myself, right? If I say I really need to defend myself and then someone goes out and proactively murders someone, I can't really say, hey, like my message to self-defense, you had no right to go murder proactively.
Gonna kill you.
When people are going to maladapt someone's message, then how can they be held liable and responsible?
not-
that's not maladapting someone's
Yeah.
message when you call them criminals, right? Or groomers or child molesters.
Or that
It's
they're
not
going to kill you
maladapting the message. The
tomorrow.
message is the malicious thing. Sorry.
You can
Can I-
absolutely maladapt it,
No.
though, right? Like you could
No,
absolutely maladapt these terms and say, "Hey, calling everyone criminals."
You're right. Mr. Girl would maladapt it.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. I mean, this absolutely can happen, right?
There's a reasonable conclusion here, which is that like if it's self-defense, right? Yes, you can say, well, you're maladapting the self-defense. Yeah, but if you say the fascists are going to be killing you in a few months or a few weeks, or if this election doesn't go the right way, or democracy is going to be subverted, this election was stolen, you no longer have an electoral process that you can
That
appeal
was
to.
smooth.
Violence
Very
is the
good.
violence is the only option. Then yeah, like you are basically telling them that the threat is incoming and they have to attack first. This is how a lot of actual violence gets started. It's preemptive violence with the view that the enemy that you're attacking is likely to attack you.
Can I ask something real
Wait,
quick?
what?
Did Tucker Carlson actually say that all trans people are groomers? Did he make that statement?
Doesn't matter. It's an example. It's hypothetical.
No, is there anybody who has said anything like
Matt
that?
Walsh, yeah, for sure. Like
Matt Walsh has said all trans people are groomers.
maybe not that specific phrase, but they want to groom your children.
I'll look it up. I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure
There's
one
like
of
a
them
clip that's pretty recent.
My
So-
question for you, I'm curious, and look it up because I think that's interesting. But
Mhm.
would if the allegation was levied against you that you were calling an entire group groomers, and that allegation by itself made it more likely that you'd be the target of violence, would that be stochastic terrorism? Would you be, by calling Matt Walsh that, would you be engaging in stochastic terrorism if that link was there?
Can I just restate that? So the idea you're saying, the idea is if we say that Matt Walsh is doing stochastic terrorism in such a way that that would cause violence, then the natural conclusion from our side would be that someone has to kill Matt Walsh to prevent the stochastic terrorism that will
Yeah.
prevent the violence.
Yeah, what about that?
I would say that would probably be a kind of stochastic terrorism to a lesser degree. Yeah,
You see, now,
but
this is ridiculous. though?
It's
This is the
terrorism
problem.
within terrorism within
Everything
terrorism.
is terrorism.
Wait a second. Wait, no.
That's how
Just-
subcategories
just
work.
wouldn't-
One at a
It's
time,
literally-
one at a time.
it's
I
a
want an
tool.
explanation for the nesting
I-
dolls and terrorism from SmugBug.
I will.
please.
Thank you. Right. So the difference is that this is not a legal process. This is a tool of analysis, right? It's a measure of degrees. We're looking at which stochastic terrorism is more likely to cause violence, right? Now, on the Matt Walsh side, they're saying literally your children are going to be groomed by pedophiles because the LGBTQ community is a front for like pedophilic grooming your children out of their identity or whatever the fuck he talks about.
Or
Whereas
whatever.
on
We got to be careful, right? We don't want to engage in any terrorism now. What specifically got to really nail down what he said, right?
I was being helpful in leaving the space of or whatever the fuck he talks about, right? You can add your own analysis of the Matt Walsh that you've watched recently. But the point is
I
that
don't
yeah,
watch
it is a
Matt Walsh.
okay. All right, sorry for sarcastically terrorizing you right there.
And for the conversation, if you guys could try to take a more general approach to these concepts instead of listing specific examples and then quibbling over whether or not those examples are technically sound.
Sure, but
The
regression was
council
the question there. Yeah.
acknowledges the existence of stochastic terrorism,
Okay,
but
Portland?
whether or not it's useful is still kind of the point that we're missing
yeah.
here.
But Portland, the reason we're using specific examples is to illustrate the absurdity of the term, right? Like, and to illustrate the absurdity of the application.
Specific
And these examples are
people,
helpful
but,
in
like,
that case because we can
Okay,
look.
I will
and-
not be argued with. I am moderating with an iron fist. And
I surrender.
Stabby
I
has her
surrender.
hand
Hands up. Don't shoot.
Example, I
Abby has her
don't
hand
think it could be okay.
Stabby, go ahead.
Actually, she could go first because I want to ask her a question. Actually.
Weaponized discourse and then Stabby.
Well, I'm just trying to highlight just the absurdity of if there is terrorism happening on both sides, wouldn't it just benefit us to speak about this in terms that doesn't possibly mass incriminate a huge amount of citizens? Again, I think the word terrorism being levied is extremely serious, and it's one that's not just going to happen casually with the state sort of standing by. It's going to get involved, and it seems like we can discuss dehumanizing and violent rhetoric and its implications on the media environment without implying causation.
Well, I mean, saying somebody is engaging in stochastic terrorism by putting incendiary or inciting language into the media from a position of extreme influence That's not targeting an entire group of people. That's accusing one person of engaging extremely irresponsibly or maliciously with their platform. So what you're talking about just doesn't bear in the conversation.
No,
Well, I want to point. The
just
reason
real
I'm
quick,
asking.
I want to
Real-
address this and
real
then
quick,
Stabby.
Oh,
Just real quick. So it is attacking a group of people, journalists, right? And that's my fear here.
No, it's
my
a journalist,
conspiracy-
right? Tucker Carlson is one man.
Journalism, indeed. This is going to be a backdoor used to censor journalists, right? It absolutely is. It's going to be used to silence people who are trying to criticize the government, because this is how it's been used before in other countries, right? Like any, I hesitate to bring this up, right?
Typically, inciting language is more silencing than asking journalists to be responsible and not calling
They don't
people.
ask.
tar-
This
Pardon?
asking does not happen, right?
Well,
What they do
encourage,
is they-
right? Like, I mean, like we do with any behavior that's incentivized, right? Like disincentivizing it by criticizing it and pushing back against it, and basically trying to reduce their audience by critiquing them to the point
The state
that their
has done
audience
more
may
than
be
that.
swayed
They
away
have
from them.
removed it. It's not criticizing it. The
So-
state has made gotten in bed with Facebook, Twitter, these other companies, these social media companies, and created backdoors where they can remove information they dislike. They intercepted a wonderful
What-
report on
Wick,
it.
hang on, Smug. I'm going to make one last
Process
comment, and then I'm
exists.
going to be silent. I'm going to be silent, please.
All
brother.
right, go ahead.
Okay, Wick, here's my fundamental problem with your take here. So you are extremely concerned with the proliferation of this language of stochastic terrorism being adopted by the state to oppress journalists and other kinds of speakers and people of particular political persuasions, yes?
That is
The
one
problem-
of them, yes.
Okay, sure. I am not seeing a commensurate concern for what has also taken place historically, which is the uptake of that dehumanizing language by the state to target other people for silencing and elimination.
Because the way to deal with that, right, isn't by dealing with the rhetoric. I mentioned this earlier, right? But there are causal effects, and weaponized discourse talked about this earlier. Like, for example, the Q shooter. He should never have been able to get a gun, right? The red flag laws should have stopped that cold. But because there was corruption involved, right, with his connection to politicians, things like that, we're not. I hesitate to speak on
No.
it too much because we don't know for sure
I'm
yet. But that is the mechanisms we should be looking at, because that's absolutely going to stop these attacks. Whereas the rhetoric may or may not, right? May or may not. It's wishy-washy, but we have concrete tools we can use. But go on ahead, Stabby. I'm sorry.
I would just like to point out that three men interrupted. Too emotional to vote. Anyway, there's an example of a fun stochastic terrorist meme about men. Anyway, my question is, that's what I've asked like 3 separate times. I've asked this 3 separate times already. What do we use in lieu of this? No one else has asked this. They just want the term to not be used ever. So what do we use? Because we're not supposed to call it far-right extremism. We're not supposed to call it right-wing terrorism. We're not supposed to call it fascism. You're not supposed to call anybody a Nazi. I get all of those. All of those make complete sense. So now we're trying to find a term that can be applied to anyone, anybody, regardless of their politics, and we're trying to use this term. And now this has to be banned too because it's not supposed to be said about conservatives. Please explain this to me.
Well, this is relevant to the backdoor thing that Wick was talking about, right? Like, I think that without these like set terms for what they need to pull out, like that's gonna be really critical. But like when you mention the backdoor thing, I'm worried about like you don't want to leave that in the hands of Facebook, right? You don't want to let like Myanmar genocide rhetoric end up like sitting around for too long. You don't want ISIS videos radicalizing people on Facebook. Like, you do need some kind of mechanism by which you backdoor in and remove messaging that is obviously dangerous. You need a backdoor to remove fucking child porn. Like, these are all going to be really important things when it comes to managing social media. So acting like the backdoor existing is a terrible thing is a little bit of a cope, Wick. I'm going to be honest.
Putting it in the hands of
No. But specifically, can you close that loop for me, though? I appreciate what you just did there. But can you close that loop for me? Like,
I think we have looped right now.
Okay,
right,
to address you,
we need
Stabby.
to use this
Stabby.
term. But what else do we use?
Well, I'm saying that the concept behind the term, whatever word you want to use, I would be against it because the concept behind it, I feel, is flawed, too vague.
Just say it's
unuseful.
stupid or wrong or inaccurate.
To address SmugBug, SmugBug's
Yeah.
point, right?
Hi.
So traditionally, the government, the state, has not been a good caretaker of these things when it comes to censorship. In fact, they
So
have
you want to leave it
used
up to the
these things-
corporations?
Huh?
You want to leave it up to the social media corporations that we all trust.
Well,
On the
I
left
think
and right,
what
we
we
love
should
them.
do, right? Like, honest opinion here is take the power
Twitter.
away from both the corporations and the state to a certain extent. The mechanisms to do so are fraught. This is a problem that I do not have a simple solution for you, unfortunately. Right? But I think that, again, when we put in the hands of the state the power to censor whatever it wants, really, it's a recipe for the disaster. It cures worse than the disease. It's going to be used as a tool of oppression rather than protection. This is just historically the case. So that's my concern.
I obviously I agree, like in a broad sense with that, but we probably want to stay focused on stochastic terrorism and things more closely related to that.
I was just addressing your point, though.
I totally agree with that. That's fine. I do want to, because I actually never got to answer the regression point, and that regression point applies to any situation where two opposing forces are attacking and counterattacking, attacking and counterattacking, right? Like, I feel like the critique that Lactoid laid out at me is similar to the critique people make of Ukraine for using propaganda and misinformation in their war with Russia. Like, Russia is doing it too. Russia is the aggressor. You can say there's an infinite recursion of Russia attacking Ukraine and using misinformation, Ukraine deploying military misinformation propaganda, which they both do, right? But ultimately, like, these are the tools that we have available. These are the guns, right? Guns are bad. They do bad things, but both sides are going to use them, particularly if one side aggressors on the other. So I would rather we focus on the aggressor, Matt Walsh, Tucker Carlson, the people initiating the aggressive rhetoric are the aggressors in this situation, and you can't say that self-defensive, which is a dumb term, I'm going to say self-defense, stochastic terrorism, you are doing a bad thing, therefore, and you should stop. Like, okay, but they should stop doing the bad thing, right? Unless you don't agree that what Matt Walsh or Tucker Carlson do has a tendency to increase the probability of violence. If that's the point you disagree with, then that's fine.
Well, I think it's kind of telling that you phrase this as an analogy to use as an analogy of an ongoing war. And I don't think the analogy completely holds even within the analogy, because I could just simply say I think misinformation is wrong. And I don't think Ukraine or Russia should do it. Right?
Have you ever used the phrase "culture war" before?
Yeah. So sure. I don't use that term, but I know it's definitely used, right? The culture war. Right. So I think here's where there's a little bit of departing, right? I mean, war is somewhat of a suspension of moral order. Do I understand why they're doing wrong things, given the situation? I suppose, maybe in some circumstances. Am I in favor of a lot of what Ukraine is doing? I'm not. I think their propaganda campaign has a lot of problems, and we can talk about that. I think the underlying motivation here needs to be highlighted. When we're talking about usefulness, what is the purpose of calling Matt Walsh a stochastic terrorist? What is the goal? When you say something like that, right? When Matt Walsh is simply expressing his honest opinion, maybe he does. Now, I don't think he's called every trans person a groomer. Maybe what he has said is, wow, there's a few events here in which they are really fucking on the edge, and maybe some fucking groomer behaviors going on, and we don't see enough criticism.
It's more explicit than that. But
so you can say it's more extensive, right? But I think that's a fair criticism. That's a criticism that I would levy, and the fact that. And unless I see something different from Tucker Carlson or Matt Walsh, or because I have no choice but to
What are you, their agent? We're talking about whether or not the term can apply. Period. If that example doesn't fit the bill, then fine.
Well, give me an example.
The example is what you're trying to deny they did. If they outright said trans people are groomers, I think we both agree already, because you're trying to make this defense, that the term stochastic terrorism would be appropriate given the description of it so far.
I don't think that. I think if you genuinely hold the belief that all trans people are groomers, you should be able to say that. I don't think that's what he said.
Hold on. If you genuinely think that Jews control the media or democracy or the banks, it's okay to say that and push that rhetoric, and it's not stochastic terrorism because you think it's true.
So it's not. I would deny that it's stochastic terrorism.
Well, come on,
Well, I'm denying that it's stochastic terrorism. That's an important part of this. Second of all, I think you should be able to say that if you genuinely doubt something or you genuinely believe something.
Okay, wait.
If you believe something is fact, do you not want people to be able to say it?
We're going Godwin. Okay, so Nazi Germany's propaganda, was that stochastic terrorism? The anti-Semitic propaganda in Nazi Germany, was that stochastic terrorism? Did it increase the propensity for violence against Jewish people as a result of the propaganda?
What?
No, the state action. No, the state action was wrong. I mean, am I in favor of public? The fact that they taxed the Jewish people and then used that money to like run propaganda campaigns, you can make an argument that you can make an argument that might be maybe not stochastic terrorism, but it would definitely be like immoral on a number of bases that I would criticize. I would not call it stochastic terrorism. I would say it's wrong.
So it's lesser precedent. So very quickly, so you don't think the forging of the protocols of the Elders of Zion had any effect whatsoever on the rise of pogroms against Jews in Russia?
It may have had an effect, but I just did in the same way that the same way that the communist man, in the same way that the Communist Manifesto led.
Well, no, because one is directly targeting a racial group. One is saying this is a political action that will take place by.
Yeah.
These are
Sure.
distinct.
No, it's not distinct in the idea of contributing to an ambiance, right? The Communist Manifesto.
Well, but the issue isn't just contributing.
Hold on,
no, hang on. No, this is important.
I'm in the middle of responding.
I know, but my response is better. So
your response to my response that I haven't said yet.
Exactly.
Let's not be petty. let Mr. Lactoid finish his point, and then President Sunday, you can respond.
Thank you, sir. So. When we're talking about, again, so the question you asked me, did the protocols of the Elders of Zion increase the likelihood that the pogroms occurred? And I said likely, right? It's probably true. In the same way that the Communist Manifesto likely increased the probability that the Holodomor happened, that the mass killings of the Soviet Union and
Holodomor.
Sure, you can lecture me on mispronouncing words. That's rich. But we can talk about Vietnam or Cambodia or all these other areas in which, this book and these writings and these theories led to a lot of suffering and led to a lot of destruction. And under your first question, under the protocols of the Elders of Zion, do I think that somebody, if they genuinely believe this, should be allowed to publish that book? Of course, in the same way, I think people should be allowed to publish the Communist Manifesto and disseminate that, even though that book is responsible for far more murder than any piece of right-wing literature you can point to.
There's a difference there's a difference between a state policy being enacted down the line that's associated nominally with a political ideology from a different country, and a document meant to imply that a specific racial group that is a part of your state is actively controlling things and ought to be targeted for extermination because they're a threat to the people.
There's no difference in principle as I've outlined it. Obviously, they're different documents.
No, there's a radical difference in principle because you're missing the crucial point here. It's not just the contribution to an ambience generally. It's the deliberate contribution to an ambience to the end of inciting terror against a group.
And you know for a fact that the people who wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion intended for the pogroms to happen.
We could bite that bullet. We could say yes.
Yes.
Probably bite the bullet
yes.
if Nazi propagandists intended for bad things to happen to the Jews.
Probably.
But I think
it's also fair.
It's falsifiable.
But the thing we're missing with this, it buries the lead, right? It buries the lead in a way, right? When we say this, because Nazi Germany, Russia, Stalinist Russia, all these other groups, like the Rwanda thing that happened, right? It wasn't the rhetoric that did it. It was them implementing policies, arming their people, rounding people up in camps that led to this. And also the duress that if the populace did not comply, they would also be considered culpable and suffer the same fate as those targeted. So the rhetoric, once again, does it play a role? Sure. But we are missing the point where it's these other actionable, measurable, easily identifiable, easily, not so easily dealt with, but you can actually concretely, institutionally, systemically deal with these things in a way that you simply can't with rhetoric because it's too fuzzy. The rhetoric portion is too fuzzy.
Kristallnacht was not a policy. It was the outcome of anti-Semitic rhetoric, right? Do you really think that the propaganda didn't cause Kristallnacht?
Kristallnacht.
The Night of Broken Glass.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I don't know the German words. I think that again, it was the. I as I understand it, they were engaging. They would go around and beat people up. It was actual violence they were doing.
Why were they beating up Jews? Why were they beating up Jews?
Well,
Gays.
the Nazis wanted power to be.
Because of different political opinions, Bug, obviously.
Wait, what? They got
I
mad in individual debates with each individual Jew.
Of course not. Of course not. Yes, it obviously. Look, rhetoric
The
obviously plays a
marketplace
role.
of ideas, bitch.
Holy
Rhetoric
fuck, Whick,
obviously
you need to
plays a role.
You can't, you're basically saying there's no connection between like 𝕵𝖎𝖎𝖙𝖐𝖍𝖐 and the shit that happened to
You're
Jewish
not listening.
people.
Obviously, there plays a role, but the bigger role that
is
we are
called stochastic
missing
terrorism.
is when
That role
it
is called
comes.
stochastic terrorism.
So okay, sure. I will give you and concede to you that in a state like Nazi
you.
Germany, that yes, it played a role. But had that been all there was, then it would not have led to what happened. There was a lot of steps that had to be taken, right? There was a lot of things that had to be in place. They just suffered a huge war, a world war, in fact, right? Like
I'm not
these.
saying the propaganda. I'm not saying the propaganda was the only reason that this happened, but it was a very useful tool. It was used to invoke individual instances of violence against Jewish people in Nazi Germany, and it was a tool of oppression. It was a way for them to inflict stochastic violence, right? Increasing the proclivity and the oppression for violence, pushing them into like more and more segregated communities because they were only safer together. Like, this is a method of oppression and genocide. This is a big part of how it's executed.
They put them in the same communities. Like the Jewish people didn't choose to gather together and segregate. They were pushed. They were forced. They were exiled into these communities.
But why was it?
Right?
Why was the government able to normally get away with that?
Well, they had guns. First of all,
no.
And anyone who opposed them was shot or disappeared. It was the security apparatus of the state, the jackbooted thugs.
We understand how efficiently we understand how efficiently the government did that. The question is, why was that not a political disaster for the government? Because there was an ambience in which this group was acceptable to be targeted by the government. This was not the basis of some kind of governmental collapse.
I hear what you're saying, but the conditions of centralization by the time Kristallnacht happened in 1938 they're unparalleled in Germany. Hitler had already centralized and had enormous use of state violence at his disposal. So, I mean, I completely concede that I think Kristallnacht is an example of stochastic terrorism, but it's almost impossible to compare this to the state conditions of any other state, really.
No, it's not. Okay.
Yeah, there have been so many times when violent rhetoric, propaganda, dehumanization have resulted in stochastic violence that ends up oppressing a group, right? The genocide or the attempted genocide in Rwanda was not a state-backed thing, or it wasn't a state-run thing, right? It was the result of propaganda. Yeah, no, it was the result.
It was both.
Well,
the state militias and the state troops went around arming the civilians and saying, if you do not help us, we will kill you too. That is absolutely state-led. Absolutely state-led.
Why were the civilians willing to be armed
because
and go immediately?
They were killed. If they did not, they were killed. It was direct.
Whick,
are you fucking kidding me?
There hadn't been there were Tutsis in government. There were Hutu moderates that were also targeted. Like, this was not simply state-led. There had to be receptivity in the populace for this. They had been calling Tutsis and Yenzi for an extended period of time through state media. There's an extensive literature on how radio was critical in making the general population amenable. By the way, it wasn't just militias. Neighbors turned on neighbors during that as well. There were also militias, but that's not exhaustive.
WD, if you want to try.
And I just wanted to clarify and just maybe respond to that as well. What I'm talking about is I would concede that these are examples of stochastic terrorism, but what Whick and I are pointing out is that there is almost unparalleled participation of the state with this stochastic terroristic propaganda. And this is why, I mean, we can discuss how this happens, and that's super useful, but I don't necessarily see we're seeing the same participation of the state here. And so to redirect the conversation to the use of stochastic terrorism here, I think is a little it's difficult for us to compare these examples.
No, I understand that. I appreciate that, but the problem we have is that we're now talking about something that is like the most extreme versions of stochastic terrorism we could say are stochastic terrorism, and both Lactoid and Whick deny that they're stochastic terrorism, and I feel like they're doing some brain loop logic to get around it.
Are you not listening? Are you not listening? Yes, absolutely. These stochastic terrorism plays a role, but you are acting as if that was the driving factor, and that is where I disagree. That is absolutely not the driving factor.
Can I quickly? Here's the fundamental problem with this conversation, okay? We're talking about whether or not the term is useful. We all agree that the term is useful. And now we're coping with that fact by doing this amateur hour history analysis when none of us have any, like, fine-grained understanding of these case studies.
Fair.
Wick doesn't even know what crystal knot was. So, like...
I don't know the German term for the not a broken class.
So
he knows the English term, it's fine.
If I may, I want to
kind of like the LA riots a little bit, right? Or
I want to just point out...
What's the German name for the LA riots?
Okay, easy, one at a time.
Yeah.
So I just want to point out that this is why I have been asking for a more useful term. I am willing to concede on not using the term stochastic terrorism. I said that in the beginning, and I'm still saying it now. The reason I have said this is because not all stochastic terrorism is going to show up as #KillAllMen. It's not going to be that obvious to go, wow, that's not even a funny point. That's pure bullshit.
Or ACAB.
That's easy. So hold on. No, all cops are bastards is an insult. Like, I don't think that that's as bad as
it's not. I don't think it's
no,
an insult.
I'm not defending it. Stop. I'm not defending it. I'm saying that all cops are bastards is not nearly as violently horrible and easy to recognize as Kill All Men. Okay, Kill All Men was it was a travesty. It was a feminism killer. But like, if you're looking at things like that, it's not always going to be that obvious. So I have distinctly, and I use the left-leaning one on purpose, because immediately in the chat, Wick, like, everybody's all like, oh, so we'll defend when lefties do it. So I'm using a leftist one on purpose here.
Amateur reading chat while we debate. Yeah. No, don't do it. It's going to trigger you.
No. It's kind of fun. But I just, what is a better term for this? We have to have a term for this because not everything will come as simply and as easily as, wow, the #KAM is fucking horrible. Like, that one's easy. What do we have that
to address your point, Stabby? To address your point again, this is my problem here. We absolutely do not have to have a term, because what usually happens in the discourse of modern day North America, Western world, Twitter, Facebook, etc., is they will find it becomes a treasure hunt of a sort, right? People look for reasons.
No, stop.
They've already decided these people are guilty.
Wait,
and it's trivially easy to find a crime.
Wait,
right?
I'm telling you to swallow something. Okay? Give me a second.
Sorry.
Well, I didn't know this was this kind of panel.
No,
okay.
I know.
Right.
I just made this fun. No, this is what I'm telling you to swallow. You're going to have to swallow not nuanced takes like, oh, so all conservatives are Nazis. And you're like, fuck, here we go again. You're going to have to accept that if we can't accept or have or educate people on a more nuanced term for us to use. Like, one of the main reasons it's being used against conservatives so much is that they're engaging in that more. Like, it's just a mathematical standpoint, but it's also because the left is finding new and milquetoasty, backstabby, passive-aggressive ways to be political, okay? So if you add those two things together, that's why stochastic terrorism is going to be hurled to the other side. We can stop hurling it to the other side a little more often if we all understand the nuance of it, if we can educate further on what it is, because you can't just run around calling every single thing, it's what was it called? Help, in 2016, it was called the alt-right playbook. Like, people were even making that the hashtag. They're like, oh, this is a typical alt-right playbook. And you're like, what even is that? So while you were catching up on the meme, it just made it more complicated, but at the same time, it was too simplistic. So we have to have something that's a little more nuanced, or get used to people calling every conservative a Nazi and just be all happy with that. That's fine. It'll work.
So I think maybe the difference is, or if I understand the question correctly, the difference here is just in, is it an incitement? Is it a call to action or not, right? If I make the term, we should go kill all men, right? This is like one statement, which is like, we should go do something. I'm issuing you a directive, like, or, we have to go get rid of the cockroaches, right? In the case of the Rwandan genocide, as they hand out guns, right?
No, because cockroaches are to be gotten rid of. So if you call somebody a cockroach, that's the direct perlocutionary effect.
Already,
here's where I think there is a difference, right? If you are just not making a call to action, but you're just honestly stating, I don't actually think this, but if I did, I think all cops are bastards, right? I dislike the police. I hate all police, right? I hate all police. That you're not making a call to action. You're saying, here's a group of people that I severely dislike. I call them bastards. I relate them to things I dislike. Because now one way is saying I'm interpreting sort of intent, or I'm interpreting some sort of culpability on your behalf for having this opinion, and that this is related to violence somehow. Or you're saying, man, this guy really hates police. Maybe he wants to defund them. Maybe he wants to get rid of their money.
Wait, can I just wait, Preston? Can you give me 1 second? Can you give me 1 second? Sorry.
I mean,
okay.
Kind of.
Hold on, you're equivocating again, because the all cops are bastards is a critique of the police, right? But what it doesn't contain
police people, right? The actual service.
Yes, right. But the difference is that you're not attributing to it an impending threat. Now there's rhetoric you can add on top of that where it becomes an impending threat, and that's when we start to get closer to more dangerous stochastic terrorism. The most dangerous stochastic terrorism is this is an impending threat, it's looming, it's coming soon, and you have no solution other than violence. That is the worst kind of stochastic terrorism, where you're saying you're about to get killed, your children are about to get groomed or taken out and have their identity besmirched by a pedophile or whatever, and it's gonna happen if you don't do something about it.
Even if you genuinely believe it, because one example.
I don't care. Still stochastic terrorism.
Okay. So
truth is not
sure. So if I say look, global warming, we have to do something, guys. These fucking logging companies are destroying this rainforest. We got to fucking do something, otherwise we're oh shit. Then people go out and spike the trees. Right. I'm responsible for that. Yeah, global warming.
Yes, that's stochastic terrorism. If you do the Vosh meme,
but what if it's real? What if there's actually global warming?
Terrorism can be done in service of real things that are happening, right? Global warming is happening.
You're stating the truth. Hold
on. Lactoid, you used the phrase eco-terrorist earlier. Do you think climate change is real?
Of course I do.
Okay, great. Hold on. So then you're saying that terrorists
I will state that because it's a
violence. Okay, great. Right. So an eco-terrorist is someone who is doing terrorism in service of a real threat. Yeah, I'm just saying you are willing to take willing to admit that a terrorist can do political violence in act of a real actual threat. And then we can debate some other time about whether that violence is justified. But that's still stochastic terrorism. I also cut off President Sunday earlier, 2 minutes ago, so he can...
I want to respond to that specific sentence, though, because the prescription of, we got a bunch of people saying global warming is real. The prescription is absurd. To call them stochastic terrorists and demonize them and say that they're not allowed to come out and say they're genuinely political opinions.
Okay, hang on.
Even though they're not making a call to action.
I need to respond to this one more time, and then I'm good. All right, listen. I'm not calling them stochastic terrorists. I'm saying again. I had multiple things here. You need to pay attention. We've got the problem, right? All cops are bastards. That's the problem. Or climate change is real. That's the problem. Then we have there is no alternative solution. Whether you state it explicitly or implicitly, you give the people the solution of violence, right? You say democracy does not work. It's not going to work fast enough to solve climate change. The only solution is ... or is, spiking the trees to prevent the logging. So the stochastic terrorist component of that is saying your only option is violence, or heavily encouraging violence as the best option in order to solve the problem.
And Matt Walsh is doing that.
Yes, he's saying that there's no... Yes, he says the state backs the trans agenda. No one's going to stop the LGBT from grooming your kids. No matter.
And so the alternative is to vote Republican. That's what he advocated for in the election.
Just a point of order,
Hey,
Smug, just a point of order. I believe that he does give a solution, right? Not to defend Matt Walsh. Far be it from me. He's a piece of shit, right? But the solution that he says is just take your kids out of public school and homeschool them, or take to private school.
Okay.
If that's his explicit solution every time he says the trans...
I don't know every time, right?
Well, hang on though. Taking your kids away from the groomers does not take away the incitement of violence against the people you're calling groomers. That's still danger against children that people would act against. People bomb abortion clinics for similar reasons. right? Like, it's not just like, you don't want abortion, don't get one. No, they think that bad things are happening to children, so they intervene violently on their behalf.
Yeah, it's not just
that
their
would be an
children.
example
It's
of stochastic
society's children,
but again,
right?
this
It's a threat.
this is
So-
too
so
broad.
let's go
because it
alternative-
is
Look,
too
here,
applicable to
we're all
everything.
missing the
Guys,
point.
one at a
Listen,
time, please.
Okay,
Wait,
can I
go
go?
ahead.
Okay, we're all missing the point, like, completely here, with the exception of SmugBug, who needs to rename his name to 𝕵𝖎𝖎𝖙𝖘𝖍𝖔𝖜. We all agree that a stochastic process
bother
can
me
be
up.
used to incite terrorism. We are hung up on the word terrorism because we assume that it's bad, even though we also are defining it as like a specific political act that can have a particular end. It can be useful. Let's leave that part aside right now. The argument is over because stochastic terrorism right now is the only term we have to interrogate something that we agree exists, which is a complex series of events that can produce terroristic violence that we need to be able to talk about and to hold people accountable for inciting.
Accountable how? Accountable
I'll
how?
even
Let's dig into this.
Well,
Real quick.
among other things, just
Accountable
pointing
how?
out, like, hey, this rhetoric dehumanizes this group of people. You can be reasonably inferred to know this. This can have the result, and we have historical examples of this taking place, of these people being randomly attacked by other people who are consumers of your rhetoric. So you need to watch your rhetoric. Don't call Group X
Or
of people.
watch your rhetoric, or else what?
Or wait,
Or
there's
Or
one
else
more.
we will use a harshly worded
Guys,
descriptor
one
for
at
your
a time.
person in public.
Stabby.
Okay, that's one of the reasons I opened this entire thing by saying that it's educating people how it's being used, especially if there are children, especially if there's somebody in a group, or we go to a town hall meeting, or you're part of an advocacy group. Educate them on how it's done, because there's another avenue here to neutering the violence from some of this rhetoric. And it doesn't involve controlling the people with the violent rhetoric. It includes showing people it's nothing to be scared of. This is what they're doing. It's rhetoric. They're trying to incite these feelings, but we're too smart for this dumb shit. Like, do shit like this all the time. All of us do stuff like this all of the time. We can actually manage this particular terminology, and we can actually make sure that we are using it as best as we can without controlling those with the violent rhetoric. Because in a world with free speech, you need something like a rudder where we have words that mean things and that we use properly so that we can navigate the fucking nightmare that is free speech.
No, and you know what? We have a great word for it. We have a great word for it, and it's called stochastic terrorism. It's
No.
how we. It's how. Yes, it is. It is. This is exactly what we're
This
talking
is
about.
not what it's
When you
being
ask-
used for. Are you?
Whick, I
Oh
don't
my
care.
God, are
Whick,
you
I don't
just-
care if some dipshit. I don't care if some dipshit says the wrong thing some way. What?
Somebody doesn't know you have to turn the wheel
I have to be
this
able to
way,
respond to
the road
this
goes
at some
that
point.
way.
Let me
Wait,
finish the
go
point
ahead.
before you respond. Oh, okay, I won't even finish the
Well,
point.
Stab-
Stabby was
Wait,
making a point.
go
I'm going to
ahead.
respond to her, and then you can make your point, and then I'll respond to you. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, Stabby. So the reason, right, that like ideally in an ideal world, sure, but this is not how the term is being used or utilized right now. This is not what is happening. What is actually happening on the ground right now is people are using it to silence their political
Back to my
opponents by censorship.
my analogy. You are misrepresenting my analogy. That's why, like, you literally have the answer right there in my analogy. I said that stochastic terrorism is one of the words that we use because it's one of the rudders on the boat. So somebody doesn't know how to steer the boat. That's our job. That's what I literally just said. Teach them how to steer the boat. Ta-da! Boom. Solved.
There is no incentive for people to teach that. The people are using it, and it's becoming a very effective tool, right? Or they believe it's a very
There is,
effective
you guys asked
tool
if I wanted to be a part of this
to not
conversation. I said,
engage it, but to just silence their enemies.
we're doing it right now. You guys asked if I wanted to engage in this, and I said, yes, please. Thank you.
Sure, we are, me and you, but neither of us are holding on to these levers of power, right? We are individuals, and I'm speaking of a general trend, right? So individually,
should have
sure, we
power.
may be
I don't
behaving ourselves, but general
Learn.
trend is
No.
absolutely
Knowledge
not
is
happening. It's like
Knowledge
saying,
is power.
well,
Stop. Knowledge is power. Education is a right, and teaching is something that we can do. It should never have anything to do with power. Knowledge alone is power, what we learn personally and individually. Like, teaching should not be something the powerful do. Teaching should be something all of us are doing down here. This is exactly how we solve stochastic. What is stochastic?
I still want to hear an answer to Stabby's question. What word would we use in its place? We all acknowledge that this is a field that needs to be tracked somehow. Like
I've
Whick, at
asked
the beginning of this
it.
conversation, you conceded
yeah.
it was useful. I want to hear like an actual answer to that. That's actually crucial. If you're saying we just can't talk about this because you're terrified of how difficult
We
this
are
would be to
talking
encode in law,
about
that's
it.
just
We're
not compelling.
talking about it right now. What I'm saying is that it's distracting us from talking about the things that we should be talking about, right? Like
Which
we
just
should
have
be
nothing to
looking
do
into
with the
red
thing that
flag
stochastic
laws. We should be
terrorism
looking
is
into
addressing.
all these different methods that the state has to prevent or mitigate these acts of violence, right? And the rhetoric
It can't prevent or mitigate a stochastic process if it can't actually identify a stochastic process, which is what your insistence on not using that term lends us to do unless you can provide a suitable alternative.
But what we're doing is we're trying to mitigate upstream, I should say, effects, like such as red flag laws, things like that. That would have absolutely stopped and mitigated the Q shooting, right? It would.
He could use a knife. He could make a bomb. There are millions of things he could do.
I have a more crude way to restate what I had asked for before, if I may. So if we are supposed to control the people using the word stochastic terrorism, but not the people using the stochastic terrorism, what do we have in the interim? Since obviously we think using the word stochastic terrorism is somehow worse than terrorism.
It's not
like that.
just the word. Like you keep getting hit on.
Not-
It's not the word. I don't
I
care about
agree.
the word.
The phenomenon is useful to analyze.
This is
Right,
literally
like-
the basis of the panel. Is the term useful?
It's
We've
the
agreed.
We don't care
concept
about the word. That's
useful.
why we're here.
The concept useful.
I would offer because it seems like, and I agree, I'm really attached to the idea of a stochastically occurring process, which, right, activates the phenomenon of the lone wolf shooter, right, and directs it with a political rhetoric towards a political objective. But I guess my question is, why is, keeping the word stochastic, why is something like stochastic violence insufficient?
It's so descriptive. I think it's great. I don't see why there's any
It's
reason
an
for
excellent
us to
word.
give
It's
it
why
up.
it came into parlance in the first place.
It's
No,
a,
no,
yeah, it's a useful word for them.
Stochastic terrorism came into parlance
Stochastic
because it was describing an ambiance.
It wasn't a lefty. It wasn't a lefty who originated the term. It was a guy writing a paper for insurance companies.
No,
Okay,
it
but
was
that was
coined in
the-
the
Yes.
popular. It was coined in the
was
popular
the
rhetoric by
2010.
G2 Geek.
No,
We
it was
discussed
coined
this earlier.
first by Gordon Wu, who wrote a paper talking about how the rate of violence can be predicted for insurance reasons.
Yeah, but that was insurance
but
reasons.
not
The reason
the
it came into
iteration.
political parlance was because of G2 Geek when he talked about Palin
No, it came into
specifically
political
making that
parlance as a
map,
result of
right?
that because
The origin doesn't matter. The point is what it means, which is the probabilistic increase in political violence. That's
The
basically
origin-
what it's, right?
The origin matters because Whick is trying to pivot to saying he disagrees with the concept. The problem is he's already agreed earlier in the conversation that the word signifies something very real that takes place. So he's now functionally against us even talking about a stochastic process resulting in terrorism at all.
Stochastic process. I asked about what does the word terrorism offer, and how can you argue that what we're seeing is terrorism as opposed to a stochastic process of violence?
Political violence. Political violence. It's
Because
political.
terrorism, no, it's not just political violence. Terrorism is very particular. It's political violence meant to incite terror for a political end, right?
Yeah.
So that can be, for example, to spook the groomers from coming out of the closet and teaching their ways to the impressionable younglings. There. That's an act of terror, right?
I would refer to Matt. Wait, I would refer to. There's a perfect example. I'm sorry, but Matt Walsh gave a speech after the shooting. He put out a video, which I'm sure plenty of people here watched, saying, "Why do you have to do this? What if you say that it's actually as dangerous to be what you are? If what you claim is happening, why do you still do it? Why can't you stop yourself? Why can't you prevent yourself from being compelled to do drag shows in front of children? Is it that important to you? Can you really not help it?" This was literally a speech he gave the day after the fucking shooting, or within a couple of days of the shooting.
And I need to point out that on Prime Kai's panel about the shooting, we didn't talk about the shooting once. In fact, somebody who's here on this panel right now, as well as Fabian, they were both, instead of talking about the people who were shot, we had to talk about, them talking about like their lifestyle and their rhetoric is what we need to focus on. So
yeah, but now you've just made this panel into that somehow. So you've just
I wasn't there
to a second panel.
I can't speak to this panel, right? Like this panel I wasn't on. I can't address it.
What was the point of that? Can we move on? That was.
When you
I guess my issue is if what the stochastic process is describing is that this violence will occur, and that what
No, the stochastic process describes the disparate causes that make it difficult to track, right? So stochastic terrorism specifically is when you have multiple like sources of things conducing to at the end of the process an act of terror. That's what stochastic terrorism is. It's an act of terrorism that is inspired by difficult, complex, difficult to trace interactions of things in media. That's what it's referring to. It's not trying to make predictions. And again, like the first paper to address this issue emphasizes that predicting the rate of violence as a result of this is not the same as predicting events.
Right, but the paper also said though that it can't predict the events, but that these events are probabilistic and that they will occur. It's difficult to pinpoint when or who.
Not they will occur. That events of this type occur with a certain frequency. Yes, Bug. Thank you.
Wait, sorry, I missed that. It's blown out. What'd you say?
Not that specific ones will occur, but that events of a particular kind will occur with more frequency. This is a very important distinction.
But this is just trivially true of any attention given to a group, person, or...
We've given such good counter-arguments to this twice, Whick.
You haven't! You have not addressed the point. You've dodged it. You've misunderstood it. You purposely misconstrued it, but you have not yet addressed it.
You need to let me, once again, you are
equivocating. Because you're just going to go off into la-la land with your rhetoric and not address my direct point.
This is a cute rhetorical strategy here. Don't SmugBug me. Thank you. SmugBug me. Thank you. My point is that we've already defined some variables here that are really important to the level of stochastic terrorism. Is there a solution other than violence? If there isn't, then you're encouraging violence. Is there an impending threat from the group that you're talking about? Well, then it's self-defensive, which further justifies your use of violence preemptively, and then it's the actual problem itself, climate change, groomers, whatever. So what we're looking at here is levels of stochastic terrorism. It's obviously going to be a spectrum because it's an analytical tool, and you're looking at whether it's easier to say this particular kind of rhetoric leads to this particular kind of increase in the probability of violence. That's the point.
Here's a great example. Here's a great illustration. Here's a great illustration. Prison, right? You go into a prison and you finger someone in that prison. That's poorly chosen word. You point at someone in that prison.
What are we talking about?
And you say, oh, we'll get to it. And you say that person is a child molester. What's going to happen to that person if you say that?
I understand your point, right?
Okay.
Like
expand it out. All right.
The chances or the likelihood, if you can prove it. Now, obviously, there are other variables at play. Like if we talk the analogy, like who are you accusing? Do they have a gang backing them up? Are they more likely to beat your ass for this, or are you going to get them? It depends on who has the power in this dynamic here. I think it's a silly analogy.
No. I think the fact that you're talking about like competing forces here, it actually demonstrates that you do think that stochastic terrorism is a relevant force, because you're having to explain the other factors that would prevent that force from acting on this situation and increasing the propensity for violence. You yourself are using it as an analytical tool implicitly.
The fact that you are in a prison is the environment, right? And the likelihood for violence in that environment is so high already, the rhetoric doesn't matter.
Okay, right, so there's no difference. If I go into a prison and I say that this person's a child molester, no difference to the probability of violence. Is that your point right now?
I think that it would depend on who
you
are. You asked for a yes or no answer to a very complex question.
Okay, no, it's not.
And this is why... No, stop. I'm going to explain why this demonstrates my point. You are looking for simple answers, yes or no, binaries, to a very, very complex set of problems. You got to let me finish. You are engaging in this binary kind of rhetoric, like it's either stochastic terrorism or it's... You know, and you're ignoring all of these other myriad points, right? You're ignoring all these other different factors at play that are more important. My point, to be clear, is not that stochastic terrorism doesn't exist. I absolutely say it does exist. I say it's not useful or helpful.
We win.
You are currently you're obfuscating this point, because my point was never that it didn't.
After this.
My thing was this was unhelpful. It's an unhelpful term. It does not have a use case where we can use it.
It's an unhelpful term. It just points to something real accurately. Thank you.
I want to... Okay.
Lactoid has his hand up. So
yeah, I want to...
Lactoid has his hand up, so we'll be throwing it over to Lactoid.
All right. This is to our opponents, and specifically SmugBug.
Oh, hi.
You've been saying a couple things. So just some of the basic criteria that I'm hearing is that, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's true. It's about, if, stochastic terrorism here is, if you, even if you believe it's true, if you like label a group, as groomers, like I think was the example, like this is, or in the prison example, like child molesters, that like violence is more likely to come to them. And this is like the process of stochastic terrorism. Is that kind of what your guys' argument is?
Yes, whether it's true or not, it increases the probability of violence. Yes,
whether it's true or not. So, if do you think to heaven,
it's still terrorism?
Do you think in the U.S., given our cultural attitude in 9/11, that labeling a group as terrorists would make it more likely that violence would come to them?
Yes, terrorists. Yes.
Okay, or saying that they engage in terrorism might increase the risk of violence coming to them.
Yes, if you say a group of people engages in terrorism, it's quite likely to,
or any individual.
I would say it stochastically increases the odds of violence occurring to them. Yes.
Okay, so by referring to somebody as either an individual or a group as a stochastic terrorist or terrorist, yes, you are yourself engaging in stochastic terrorism every single time you use that term.
I'm going to bite the bullet on that. I'm going to bite the bullet on that one. I'm going to bite. Hang on.
At the same time.
I got a third follow-up point after I get an answer.
Okay. All right. Yes, I think I'm fine biting that bullet.
Okay. And did not Syndrome from The Incredibles once say that once everybody's super, no one is?
Oh God, that's so
if when we live in this world,
oh my God,
if when we live, hold on, if when we live in this world where like we're talking about the usefulness of a term, and we can't even use this term in any kind of practical application without ourselves being terrorists. Okay. How useful is this term?
Lesser President. I've got Smug, please. I let you go first. Last time.
Okay. All right, if I go first.
Lesser President, I have a very particular answer.
Even if it's true.
Yes, even if it's true. Earlier on, I was very particular. I think the use of the term is that it creates a chilling effect on people using dehumanizing language in a very reckless kind of way, targeting specific groups of people. I am therefore advocating for the use of the term to have a terror effect on people who would use that kind of language. I'm perfectly fine with that. Now we litigate whether or not a certain type of political action is justified or allowable given its consequences socially. That would be a level of particularization we can have following from that, or what kinds of threats of terror we're willing to accept, because of course the state rules by fear ultimately in every single case.
Sure.
I bite the bullet for revolution.
You're all terrorists. Crazy. This is an interesting interesting conclusion to the debate. I didn't know that.
Lactoid, one more thing. Your syndrome thing, right? If everyone has a gun, no one has a gun. The point is, this is a weapon that everyone has access to, and we should be focusing on who is creating the situation where violence is more likely to occur.
Well, you are by calling them terrorists.
The aggressor here, or rather Matt Walsh is the aggressor here, right?
You are.
Right? You're engaging in self-defense.
You're engaging in self-defense.
You have no other recourse than to preemptively defend yourself, right?
By calling him a terrorist. Yeah, you have to.
Against what? Let's roll
against his stochastic terrorism, which he's doing in response to your stochastic terrorism.
Now this is where truth becomes important. Yes, it's stochastic terrorism, but now we determine whether stochastic terrorism is being done in service of a true problem or one that is made up. So then we argue, so if the groomer problem is genuinely true, let's say the Jews. Whether
in service of your political agenda or theirs. That's ultimately what it comes down to, right?
If the Jews actually control the world, then stochastic terrorism, hold on. Let's go with Jan 6. It's really easier.
Just eat the L, Smug. Just eat the L, take it, move on, go home.
There's no L here. There's no L. Yeah. Performative. Anyway, the problem here is that stochastic terrorism can be done in service of something truthful or not truthful. So we're going to disagree on whether the grooming thing is happening, but that's the source, right? Let's say Jan 6. If you believe that democracy is being stolen, Jan 6 is totally morally justifiable. From that perspective, if it isn't being stolen, then Jan 6 is a terrible disaster, and we have to determine the truth to decide not whether it's stochastic terrorism, but whether the stochastic terrorism is justified. Because if democracy was truly stolen, Jan 6 would be justifiable. That much would make sense if the election was actually stolen. I'm happy to bite that bullet. It's an obvious one.
So why not, instead of focusing on whether or not something is stochastic terrorism, we focus instead on a far more salient point on what is true and what is not.
Because of all that stuff he just said, Whick.
Oh, it's a gun.
Again,
It's a tool.
This is tautological. It's
It's
circular
a
in
gun.
nature. You're just going round and round in circles, justifying your own rhetoric.
It's a gun. It's a means of applying political force. Stabby, I'm sorry, you've been holding your hand up.
This is what I said in the beginning. This is literally was the first fucking paragraph.
Stabby,
This
this
is
is not a
political
liberal panel. You have to
dogmatism.
be violent.
Yeah, Stabby, you
Stabby,
got scream.
go.
Stab.
That's why I think that one of the reasons that we
Adam.
want to use this word and we want to find its boundaries and make sure that we're using it properly. I did like what Olive said, weaponized discourse. I very much liked that portion about, you called it stochastic violence, correct? Okay,
Well,
I like that
I was
one.
asking. I was genuinely asking. Yeah.
Okay. I like that one. Now, it doesn't show the political nature, so we should have to be more careful of that. But that's why I was asking for it, because yes, I will bite the bullet that we have used stochastic terrorist methods for our own revolutions in this country. And unfortunately, if Jan 6 had been true and they had done that and we have all of the qualifiers there and everything had been on their side and they had actually finished overthrowing the government, then we would have a foundation myth based off of that. So I'm fine with biting that bullet, but stochastic terrorism and the term itself is a way that we're trying to get past some of these behaviors, get past some of this rhetoric, and try to enact something better for ourselves. Try to get people to understand as they approach
Create
it.
a chilling effect on it. Yes, absolutely.
Right. Personally, I don't just want to use the term stochastic terrorism to reach people who are saying, if we're gay, we have to arm ourselves because all the conservatives are trying to kill us. And you're like, whoa, calm down. That's bad rhetoric too. Let me show you what I mean. I don't want to just reach them for hope. I want to reach the fucking people engaging in something they might not even know is stochastic terrorism. How many things could we actually nip in the bud? I said neutered before, if we can start approaching it with more nuanced versions of language. I said we wanted the rudder on the boat. So instead of being so pro free speech and worried about the government coming after stochastic terrorism that we ban the word stochastic terrorism, step back for a second and let's learn how to fix the goddamn
And the
rudder.
concept, Stabby. Be careful. You said
No one's
concept.
banning the word.
No
No one's
one-
banning
no
the
one-
concept. No one's saying you
ban it.
can't. I'm just saying it's
Hey,
unhelpful.
Stone Wolf! They're burning the books! Oh, come on.
I think the real terrorists
Don't be
were
sour.
the friends we made today.
True. The only
there we go.
you know what? The only ship we need is friendship, gang, and we've made friendship. We are kind of winding down, right?
So looping pretty hardcore.
Hold on. As the moderator, hold on.
Okay.
We are kind of winding down, so
Fuck you, I'm a terrorist. Moderator.
I accept the accusation, the label with pride. I'm a terrorist. I'm just not the most terroristic on the panel, so I'm good. I would like to give
R.I.P.
everybody
Wick's channel. My God.
I'd like to give everybody maximum of 2 minutes to make some closing statements. And you will be timed. You will be muted if you exceed your 2 minutes. And we will be going with President Sunday first on this round. Go ahead.
You can't prove I was there. I have an alibi. They're all liars. Next.
Brief as always, much appreciated. Stabby, please give us your closing thoughts.
I think that we need to be careful about how we use language, try to educate one another, make sure that you're having these discussions. I think that's what's most valuable. You can definitely come and watch panels like this, but definitely engage in this with your friends so that we can use these things properly, because stochastic terrorism can be done by anybody. So I definitely think that it's a term that we need to have as useful, and don't just use it for anyone. Also, please ban from your lexicon, this is a stochastic terrorist. We don't need more labels for people at this particular point in time. What we need is to understand what stochastic terrorism is as a concept. So let's just stay focused on that and don't just start calling people stochastic terrorists. So don't make them victims.
Over to Wick.
So yes, anytime you bring attention to a thing, whether it be a positive or a negative manner, you increase the chance that people will interact with that thing in either a positive or a negative manner. This is just trivially true. And this when you get to the root of it, this is all stochastic terrorism is saying, that if you are negative about a thing and draw attention to it, some people maybe someday down the line are going to react negatively to it. This is going to be used as a weapon, and it's being used as a weapon right now to attack journalism and attack free speech. This is why I find it not only unhelpful, but kind of a dangerous topic. Not a topic, but a dangerous concept, if you will. That isn't to say we shouldn't talk about it. It is a new concept, and it definitely does need more research, and it does need more people studying it. As of today, however, with the information I have on my hand, on my fingertips, if you will, I just don't find it helpful or useful in engaging with the world and trying to do what I think we all here want to do, is to stop these heinous attacks on of violence and incidences of violence against people. Yeah, thank you.
You muted, buddy.
SmugBug, you're up.
Moderating himself. Right. You conceded that stochastic terrorism is real. We all agreed that it does happen on both sides. We agreed that it is a force that's useful to it's useful to analyze this force in situations where words increase the probability of violence. I agree with Whick. I think it is a weapon. I think it's one that's worth analyzing. I think it's one that's worth critiquing the aggressors for instigating and using when they are not appealing to truth. You can use it in both a truthful and a non-truthful way, but in both cases it's stochastic terrorism, and it's about the justification of that political violence. You evaded disavowing Nazi Germany's propaganda as having an impact on whether Jews were subjected to stochastic violence. I can't believe you wouldn't be willing to bite that bullet. We confidently bit every bullet with total consistency across the board, the rarest case of lefty unity, and you choked on your L's this entire debate. Very sad.
Amen.
Weaponized discourse. You're next.
I'd just like to say I did bite that bullet. I don't know if I could get my statements in there, but I'm really happy with today's conversation. I don't really feel like there's enough crosstalk about this word, and I've been really satisfied with what people have brought to the table. I am glad that there's a concern with how the popular usage may be drifting a bit from its intended usage, and I do concede that there is a phenomenon of stochastic terrorism, but if that word is going to be used so frequently insofar that both sides are being potentially called terrorists, I think we've handed the state a really useful mechanism for surveillance and limiting free speech, and I think we should be a lot more careful with this term than we currently are.
Lactoid, you are last, but you don't get to use everybody else's extra time. You are still limited to 2 minutes.
Sure. So in my opening, I stated that the use of the term stochastic terrorism here was, quote, is a term reserved solely for the dogmatic motivation of unjust censorship, which I think was just revealed in the big ending right there, in which our opponents just straight up admitted, yeah, it's a political term that we use for political dogmatism. Technically we're all stochastic terrorists, but we're just the good ones, and they're all the bad ones, so we got to use it just the right way. I think they should speak for themselves. I am not a terrorist, and you all are free, without any fear of violence, to come find me at Anti-Communism United on Discord and Twitch.
Just what a terrorist would say.
Gang,
Yeah.
post your links in chat, gang. This has been great. I really enjoyed this discussion. Sunday, thank you for coming. Really appreciate you. Hopefully we can have you on
I
again
think
at some point.
with our remaining 7 minutes of airtime, I would like to relitigate Whick's terrible movie takes for
We will
just a minute.
discuss this later.
Actually, can I just say, weaponized discourse, you're right. I don't include you in my statement. That was fair. You were much more graceful.
Well,
I'm
that's
going
true.
to, in
I
my
will
final
bite that
act as
bullet.
moderator, I'm going to hand the W to the lefties, only because Lactoid and Whick refused to bite such outstandingly obvious bullets vis-a-vis Nazi
Portland, you
propaganda.
didn't come
guys
in here as a
listen.
neutral party. Don't pretend you were
I
neutral.
don't listen to terrorists, okay?
True.
So I don't negotiate with terrorists, so I don't want to.
We'll let the audience decide.
terroristic.
And
That is
honestly,
literally terrorism.
if you're
Refusing
trying-
to listen to the moderator.
Oh shit! I called you. Now I'm a terrorist. Fuck.
gang, stop! I'm taking the moderator hat back. Okay, I just want to tell people.
State control.
No.
Yeah.
This is why you were worried about that. I get it now.
State violence. Let's go. It's a war.
Let's go!
Okay. Funny. Ha ha ha.